Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angus and I am live streaming here from the Stryd headquarters in Boulder, Colorado. I recently ran CIM, the California International Marathon, and I had a success training with Stryd, racing with Stryd. And today I'm going to be sharing some of my learnings and I'm going to be giving you some practical tips on things you can apply to your own training to keep improving with Power Data and with Stryd. And this is going to be a bit different than my last presentation on this topic because now that I've trained for 2 marathons, I can compare and contrast the 2 training cycles and share some really valuable learnings on things I changed and things I kept the same across the training cycles. So as we can see on this image here, I did set a 13-minute PR and I ran a Boston qualifying time. And we can start to compare and contrast now. I ran the Grandma's Marathon in Duluth, Minnesota in June of this year. I ran 2 hours, 57 minutes, and 20 seconds. And then just on Sunday, I ran CIM at 2 hours, 44 minutes, and 56 seconds here. And that's around 9% faster. And that ended up being a 13-minute PR. And we can see my race here, and we're going to be diving deep into this power data on how I executed the race, how I trained to run this power target, and how I got the overall power improvement from the last race. So to start off here, before about a week ahead of the race, I really dialed in my power duration curve. I met all the requirements for an accurate race prediction here, and I generated the prediction on the race power calculator on Stryd Power Center. So if you do have the Stryd membership, you can go to the race calculator tab on Stryd Power Center, load in a course here. So I selected the CIM course, which I downloaded from from Strava. I got a CIM course. I uploaded that to the race power calculator, and that gave me the distance of the race, the elevation profile of the race, and then the absolute elevation the race took place at. And then with the weather forecast, I was able to put in the racing at and temperature and humidity around 50 degrees Fahrenheit and slightly lower humidity here. So using all that data and using my Stryd profile, the race power calculator was able to give me a race plan. And it gave me an estimated time of 2 hours, 44 minutes, and 46 seconds, and a target power of 415 watts. And I raced within 10 seconds of that race plan. I finished 10 seconds slower at 2 hours, 44 minutes, and 56 seconds. And I ran within 1.5% of the power plan at 409 watts. So for both of those, I gave myself a green check mark. I executed the race plan overall pretty well. And the race power calculator was invaluable to me to help accurately plan, set expectations, and then pace this race. And that 409 watts, that was around a 4% improvement in power versus June. So I averaged 392 watts in June at Grandma's Marathon and 409 watts in December. So when you start to have Stryd power data, you can look at your improvement and your personal records in lots of different ways. So I was 9% faster, but the course was more favorable. So when I do a more apples to apples comparison using power, I can see I still improved pretty significantly at 4%. So to contextualize this presentation, I'm using a chart from Coach Steve Palladino of the Palladino Power Project. And these are variables that determine training plan outcome here. So we can see in the center, we have performance on race day. That is, the power you output on race day, the time you finish out on race day. And then there's 6 factors that influence that. So I'm going to be diving into each of these 6 factors: race execution, fitness at start of the plan, health and injury status at start of plan, compliance with training plan, injury and illness avoidance, responsiveness to training prescriptions, and conditions on race day. Looking at these 6 factors and seeing how each of these factors individually contributed to that performance on race day. So first, we're going to be starting with that race execution and performance. So this is a screenshot of my Stryd Power Center of that activity. And I have my power graph and my pace graph up here. So you can see the power in yellow there and the pace in blue. And the point I want to make here is power was absolutely critical for pacing this race. And you can see the pace value swung drastically. So you can see the power was much flatter. It still had some of the swings. I was still pushing very hard up on the uphills, and I was getting caught up in the crowd a bit. So you can see I wasn't following the power target precisely on a second by second basis. On an average basis, I did extremely well. But if I didn't have power to help guide that and help normalize that effort, you can see I never would have been able to use pace to start pacing my effort, because you can see how much it drastically swung on the slight downhills and the slight uphills throughout the entire race. So we looked at the race execution on a second by second basis. Now let's zoom in. No, let's zoom out on the average power execution, looking at the first half versus second half power splits. And once again, this is a chart from Coach Steve Palladino of the Palladino Power Project here. And what this represents is the optimal racing range you want to be in when comparing a first half versus second half power split. And for example, if my average power for the race is 409 watts and the first half of my race is executed at 409 and the second half of the race is executed at 409, I'd be right in the center of this chart at that 0% ISO power. In this case, I did run the first half of the race at a higher power output, 421 watts, and the second half at a lower power, which is 398 watts. So this places me at -3% here for this chart. So you can see on the left side, we have the negative values. On the right side, we have the positive values. So I did place myself outside of that optimum racing range in terms of my race execution. And you can see that does correlate with a reduced chance of a PR. And there's a few ways I can look at this. The first way I can look at this, that I can say, well, if I had executed this race better, I would have finished faster. I possibly could have had a PR by even more time and even more power. And the other way I can look at this and say is, for my next race, I have an opportunity to learn. I have an opportunity to execute this race better. And I know I'm potentially even, fitter, and I have a, potential to run even faster during my next race in terms of power and time if I execute it better. So I can take a glass half empty or a glass half full perspective on this, but it gives me that learning opportunity where I can tweak my racing plan for next time. So the next time you execute a race with Stryd, I definitely recommend to look at that first half versus second half power and compare yourself against this chart and see if you fall within that optimum racing range. The second way I want to look at this race execution and performance is fueling. So going into this race, I was using Martin gels, gel 160s. I had a plan to consume one gel every 30 minutes. And since I knew my race would take around that 2 hours and 45-minute mark, I knew I could kind of space those gels out nearly perfectly there. So breaking down those 30-minute power splits, we can see that first split, 423, I was within that optimum pacing range. I took that first gel. The second split, I was within a single watt, also within that optimum pacing range. I took that second gel. That third split, I was right on my power target, 415 watts, also within the optimum racing range. Then I took that third gel, and I was still doing pretty good, 407 watts. I was still within the optimum pacing range we just looked at on the previous slide. And then at 2 hours, I felt I was, pretty close to the finish line. I didn't feel like consuming another gel, and potentially this could have cost me. And I did skip that final and fourth gel at the 2 hour mark. And for those final 40 minutes of the race, I did fall outside of that optimum pacing range at 388 watts. So this is once again another way to look at your race. Look at the power splits in relation to your fueling strategy, and look for potential to say, should I fuel more? Should I follow my fueling plan exactly? Would that have helped me raise up my power splits throughout the entire race? And in this case, I definitely once again think I could have performed even better during this race, and I could have reached that optimum pacing range if I had consumed that final gel. So this is definitely a learning I'm going to take away from this race and apply it moving forward. Another way you can use your race execution and performance is to complete comparisons. So earlier I had my race plan for CIM that was prior to the race. And now, let's say out of curiosity, I want to see if I had this power output for the Grandma's marathon race I ran in June, what would that translate to in terms of time? So Just hypothetically, I took my power output from my CIM race, 409 watts. I plugged that into the race power calculator, a feature of the Stryd membership. I input that Grandma's marathon course, and we can see that would translate to roughly a 2 hour and 50-minute finishing time on the Grandma's marathon course race. So this is just a different way to kind of contextualize your performance and compare performance across time is, take your power output from one race and plug it into a different course. So now I want to look at my metrics. What changed across metrics across the two races in terms of race execution and performance? So this first line item here, we have power. And as we talked about earlier, that power did improve by roughly 4% from June to December for those marathon races. And then three other metrics I took particular notice on was leg spring stiffness, impact loading rate, and cadence. And we can see across those two races, my leg spring stiffness stayed constant at 13.8. And additionally, my impact loading rate stayed constant at 57. And finally, my cadence improved by roughly 5.1% from that June race to that December race. So it is kind of expected the cadence would increase a bit because I was running faster. One thing that I found particularly interesting was the impact loading rate. So the CIM course is known for being a downhill course, definitely has more downhill and would produce a faster time than Grandma's, as I just learned from that last slide in terms of the comparison. But the interesting thing is that impact loading rate stayed constant at 57 across those two races. And I thought that was very interesting. And one of the takeaways I had from this is, was there a relationship between my increased cadence and the impact loading rate? And one piece of important context here, I am relatively heavy compared to most runners at 200 pounds and relatively tall at 6 feet 6 inches. So this has led to a lower relative cadence for me as well when considering these two factors. But I do believe for me, increasing the cadence led to that maintained impact loading rate at that increased speed. So as we know, that impact loading rate, that is a feature of the next gen Stryd. And if you did want to read more about the impact loading rate, you can go to blog.stryd.com or search for impact loading rate on Google. And I just want to highlight the definition of that impact loading rate from this article. And that impact loading rate is that initial rate of increase in vertical force as a runner contacts the ground with their foot. It's reported in units of body weight per second. And this is an overall metric of how much load is being applied to the lower body over time. So those higher values mean force is being applied at a faster rate, and lower values mean force is being applied at a lower rate. So if there is anything you can do to, when you're running for multiple hours, and there's anything you can do, whether that's choosing a slightly uphill route, or um, you know, making conscious changes using form cues to your running form to lower those impact loading rate values, that can be advantageous, because if you absorb too much impact loading rate, that can be associated with overuse and those higher lower body stress scores. So I believe the increased cadence allowed me to increase that speed and maintain that impact loading rate. And this is definitely something I'm going to be touching a bit deeper on in this presentation um, on maintaining that health status. And that goes to the next point in the factors that determine improvement, that is injury avoidance. So I just completed my previous training cycle from roughly January to June. I started a new training cycle in late July to December. So I knew from my previous training cycle, I kind of discovered a sustainable lower body stress score. So that lower body stress score, once again, that is created from that impact loading rate data. That is a feature of the next gen Stryd, also available on Stryd Duo. And part of my strategy for this training cycle was, um, avoiding injury. And I knew that I had a sustainable lower body stress score from my past cycle. And I knew if I stayed at or below those lower body stress scores, I would probably be okay and be able to maintain a healthy running routine moving forward. So here in these pink bars, we can see my, lower body stress score bars from that first training cycle versus the second training cycle. You can see, I was either at or below the level for most of the training cycle. So this is the value of Stryd data. When you have Stryd data across one training cycle and then you start a second training cycle, there's a lot you can learn and apply from that first cycle to your second cycle. And just to specifically draw a point of comparison, my highest LBS long run in that June cycle, it was 282 LBSS. And this is something I talked about during my first presentation. I was really trying to amp up those lower body stress scores since this was my first marathon. I really wanted to build up the resilience there to make sure I could sustain the pounding of, that endurance race, and I reached super high values. During this cycle, I knew I just didn't have to reach those same high values. So I definitely cut it down a bit for even the lowest, even the highest LBSS long run. And you can see that dropped around 50 points. I still averaged kind of that same impact loading rate during the activity, but since I was faster, I was running, the same or longer distances in a shorter amount of time. You can see that my LBSS was lower. And this also mattered on race day for that June marathon. My LBSS for that race was 294, where since I was running a shorter amount of time and I was maintaining that same impact loading rate, you can see my LBSS for CIM in December was 273. So I didn't have to put those same LBSS scores into training because I kind of had a feeling that my LBSS demands would be lower for this training cycle. So moving on to the third point, compliance with training plan. In this case, I followed the same training plan as I did for the last cycle with minimal to no changes. I felt like I had more to squeeze out of that training plan. Since I had a better feel for the workouts this time around, I knew I could execute each of them better with the help of power. You're executing those workouts with more precision. Maybe extending a workout when I felt like I needed to slightly, or just making a small change kind of based on the data and my personal feels. So I was able to comply even better with the training plan this time around versus last time around. And, power definitely helped me a lot in that because I had the data to make those decisions with confidence when I would make small tweaks to my plan. So the next bubble in that chart is testing and responsiveness to training prescriptions. And I've grabbed a chart from Coach Steve Palladino once again to kind of illustrate this. And we can see on the right side that upward spiral of fitness and these four different components of the spiral of fitness. Number one, testing or racing. That helps you gauge your improvement. Number two, execution of those testing and racing sessions. When you do that properly, you really get an accurate idea of your fitness. We can see there vertically the plan progression. As the plan kind of progresses your speed or endurance, you can start to see that reflected in the testing and the execution of those races. And then number four, consistency. So if you train consistently, as we all know as endurance runners, that's one of the biggest factors towards improvement. So as I kind of built up my training cycle and made changes to my training plan, I made sure to include a multitude of races, time trials across many different distances to keep that power duration curve up to date, keep that race power calculator up to date, and have a really good idea that I was responding well to the training and make sure I was on track. Moving on to the next point, health and fitness at start of plan. My health and fitness at the start of plan was good. I had taken roughly a 1 month kind of small lower period of lower volume training cycle after the last marathon and then picked up a new plan right at that 1 month mark. So my health and fitness was good, and I was building on top of the health and fitness established from the last plan. So moving on to a few key points here on course specific preparation that kind of moves beyond the chart. So CIM is well known for having rolling downhills, and I trained rolling downhills in training. And that's the beauty of power, in that you can basically simulate race conditions in training. So when we're applying that power value is accounting for those differences in, terrain and wind and other numerous factors that can cause changes in your efforts. So um, since I knew I'd be running on rolling downhills, I trained rolling downhills in training, and that helped me prepare with specificity. And I see there was a question on my data field preferences, and I have included that here on the data field preferences. So the two data fields I'm looking at to make decisions on my training, it's pretty simple. I'm looking at real-time power and I'm looking at duration. I also have cadence and pace on my data screens, but those are more for confidence. I'm not making any major decisions based on cadence or the pace. Those are helping me, have confidence things are going correct during my training. But the two data fields I'm making real decisions off of, once again, are the real-time power and the duration. And the real-time power I'm checking that as terrain changes, which you can see is so critical at the start of this race with so many terrain changes. And then I'm also checking that periodically to make sure I'm maintaining that consistent rhythm. Let's say on a long straightaway, I'm just checking the watch, making sure, okay, my personal feeling is aligning with my true effort. And the second data field I'm looking at is duration. I'm checking that at major mile markers, for example, the 10K mark, the half marathon mark. Once again, kind of building confidence, making sure I'm on track, making sure everything's going well according to the race plan in terms of both power and duration. Then I'm also checking that duration field periodically to time the gel intake. So, for example, I was taking gels every 30 minutes. So that is how I was using the duration to make decisions there. And those are my takeaways. So if you have questions, put those in on the chat. I did want to go back to this chart here because I think it's so critical, give you guys an opportunity to look at that as you're thinking of any questions. And we do have some questions that passed on, so I'm going to start answering those. So Max asks, what metrics did Angus have on his watch during the race? And just for clarity there, the four metrics I was looking at was the real-time power. I had that on both the Garmin watch I was wearing and the Apple watch I was wearing, so I can also kind of view the zones. In this case, I didn't really have to look at the zones because I knew my power target with precision, but typically I do look at those zones during training. The second was duration. The third metric I had there was pace. And the fourth metric I had on there was cadence. The next question is also from Max saying, is there a way to plan LBSS like RSS? Is it only possible after executing workouts and races? And Max, my tip for this is um, you want to look at a workout that had an LBSS that you think would kind of acts as a baseline. So, for example, if I go out for let's say I go out for a 20-mile long run, and I know that produces roughly a LBSS of 200, and I want to train that LBSS. I want to amp that LBSS up very slightly. One thing I might do the next time I go out for that 20-mile long run is I might change my route a bit, add in some more downhills, um, look for less uphills. And when I do that, I know from running downhill, my LBSS is going to increase slightly. And I can kind of train that LBSS to be higher without running faster necessarily. And when I do that, I can kind of, start to build that LBSS with, some structure and kind of a methodical build of that LBSS. So it is only possible to view after workouts and races, but you can use that data to kind of help guide how you're going to train, the routes you're going to run, if you need to amp up the intensity slightly for those runs, and kind of methodically build that LBSS, similar to how I did it in this chart here. So some of these LBSS increases came from duration and intensity, but also some of these LBSS distances increases came from just changing the route on my runs just a bit. A question asks, could we use the new generate workout feature for the post-marathon recovery weeks? And that's a great question. And what I would do there is I would use the generate workout feature as a complement. So I would kind of plan out my post marathon recovery weeks, um, kind of methodically, either using the workout builder, training plan builder, or just grabbing, for example, a plan from the Stryd workout library, kind of a maintenance plan. And then you can use that generate workout to complement the workouts that are added to your calendars. So you're going to get those lower RSS, kind of perfect match, and then slightly harder workouts when you hit that generate button. So, for example, if you wanted an easier option, you're not feeling so good post marathon recovery, you can hit that generate and grab that lower RSS option. And my producer, Kaylee, added in a point that said after a break of more than 14 days, the system recommends lower intensity workouts to ease back into training. So if you did take a few weeks off after that marathon and you start using that generate button, you are going to receive those lower RSS workouts. I have a question from Kurt Reynolds here that says, you were taking gels every 30 minutes at 30-minute intervals. Were you carrying those with you? And Kurt, I was. So for this race, it was the nutrition sponsor was Precision Hydration, and they had gels available at 4 mile mark, half marathon, and kind of later in the race. Um, for me, I hadn't used those precision hydration gels before, and I was comfortable carrying the Martin gels on me. I do wear the Bandit half tights, and those Bandit half tights do have kind of pockets that are specifically sized for those gels. So I had two gels on each side of me on each hip. So I was carrying those gels with me, and I was taking those every 30-minute intervals. But for this race, I'm sure some runners did not, and they could have picked those up along the race course. But if you have a good pair of shorts that you're comfortable with that kind of have those pockets built in, I do find it easy to carry those gels with me. I have a question from Morton saying, congrats, and that massive personal best. What training plan did you use? Did you use Paladino level 5? And Morton, great question. If you go watch my presentation from June of this year, I do talk about the training plan I use. What I'm using the book Run Faster by Brad Hudson and Matt Fitzgerald. So let me screen share what this book is. So I'm using Run Fast from 5K to the Marathon, How to Be Your Own Best Coach from Brad Hudson and Matt Fitzgerald. Of course, if you want an easy option, I would just recommend grabbing a Paladino plan from the Stryd training app. Part of my journey in this marathon was learning more about run training and kind of modifying and understanding how to convert a non-power based plan to a power based plan. So I took a non-power based plan from this book, and I have been modifying it and updating it to power and using it personally. For this book, I did find it easy to kind of convert those plans to power-based plans, and it worked well for me. Of course, if you want an easier option, that's going to be excellent. I would just recommend grabbing that Paladino plan, but this is the specific plan that I used. A question from Paul saying, did you set up your race as a workout? And great question, Paul. So I did not set up my race as a workout. Um, for me, I was looking at that real-time power value and that duration value. I've been running with power for nearly 10 years now. I do feel like I have a very good idea of kind of my pacing once I establish a constant power value. So for me, looking at the watch is good enough. Even advanced runners do set up a race as a workout. For me, I'm just looking at that power value. But if you do want that extra guidance, I would recommend setting up that race as a workout. And I want to thank everyone for watching along. I know there's a lot of great comments in here from Darren, Run Boston Bear, um, Ron Craig. Thank you all for your congratulations. I really appreciate that. I know you've been, supporters of Stryd and then supporters of me personally for a long time, and I really appreciate that. Thanks to each of you for watching and commenting. I really appreciate it. We have a question from Kurt saying, I was a bit late to the presentation. What watch were you wearing? Was it the same for training and racing? So Kurt, since I do test a lot of the Stryd product as well, I do wear two watches typically. I wear a Garmin Forerunner 955, and on that Garmin Forerunner 955, I do use the Stryd Zones data field. That Stryd Zones data field, for those of you who are not aware, that just integrates in the native run mode on the watch and offers incredible features like power zones and customizable metrics and fields. So I use that on the Garmin Forerunner 955, and then I also run with an Apple Watch Ultra. And for both of those, I'm looking at the same data on both of those watches. And I wear two watches just for testing. It's something I'm comfortable with because we're always working on great updates. We want to make sure those updates work great for you. So we test them out in the field ourselves in the same conditions that we expect you to test them in. So, but I think both watches are great. So if you're ever between a Garmin watch or Apple Watch, you can't go wrong because we offer great Stryd solutions on both of those devices. That is all the questions we have for today, and I want to thank everyone for joining me. I hope you have some some practical tips you can apply to your own training. I hope you've learned something from myself and my presentation of some of Coach Steve Palladino's charts here. And you can find those in the Palladino Power Project as well. There's a lot of great knowledge there. A lot of that filters into the Stryd community, but if you ever want to go directly to the source, you can find that in the Palladino Power Project. Also, for the month of December, if you do want to try some of these Stryd membership features, such as the race power calculator that I used pretty heavily in my planning for this race, we have a 30-day free trial of the Stryd membership. So if you're not a Stryd membership user for the holidays, you can go into the Stryd mobile app or the Stryd Power Center. And there's going to be a banner there, and that'll allow you to redeem 30 days of free Stryd membership. So go test out some of the features I mentioned, whether that's building your own post-marathon recovery training plan, or using the generate workout feature, or using the race power calculator to help plan for your next race. Those are available as part of the Stryd membership, and you can access those features for free for the next 30 days whenever you activate the Stryd membership. So go check that out and go a level deeper into Stryd with that Stryd membership. That is all I have for today. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us. Subscribe to the Stryd YouTube channel.